Greetings from Provincetown, Massachusetts, our home base for the third annual Broto Art, Climate and Science Conference. This is session number 4. It's called COVID's Eco Lesson in Behavior Change. It's inspired by the extraordinary times we live in today. I'm Ian Edwards, and I'm the producer of this conference. Normally we host this conference in person, but the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to change a lot of our behaviors, including delivering this conference digitally. So we have lockdown, protective gear, we have hygiene rules, we have social distancing, and while the economy has taken a real hit, nature's done pretty well. I mean, improved air quality, animals taking over civic centers, more time with our families, curbed commuting and travel. So we asked ourselves, what about the COVID crisis and how we've adapted our behaviors at planet scale can help us deal with the climate crisis? We're beaming in from beautiful Provincetown, which is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise related to climate change. With just one big storm, this small town can be underwater. It's happened. Our COVID panel includes Peter Weeme, a 25-year veteran of sustainability. He's presently Vice President of Social Purpose and Stakeholder Engagement at the BC Lottery Corporation. Behavior Science, Dr. Amy Bucher is Vice President of Behavior Change Design at MadPow and has got a new book, Engaged Designing for Behavior Change. And Danielle Siembieda is Managing Director of Leonardo, the International Society for the Arts, Sciences and Technologies, which among its works produces a peer-reviewed journal. And she's an independent artist working at the intersection of environment, technology, and community. These sessions are free, but we are accepting donations, and a special thanks to a couple of our sponsors, the Palette Fund and WOMR. So with all of our sessions, these are pre-recorded in part, and we will do a live Q&A session right after. So register your questions in the Q&A chat box. We look forward to the debate, and please register for more of the sessions. So now on with this session, COVID. Thanks. Welcome everyone to Broto Art, Climate and Science. It's our 2020 conference. Inspired by time and the times we live in. My name is Ian Edwards. I'm founder and producer of this event. And our foundation, our ideas are really based in meaningful and substantive art and science collaborations pointed at climate change. What new insights come from putting people of disparate ideas together in the same room? One of those benefits is conversation. So I wanted to say, that we're lucky to have a bunch of conversationalists right here in our panel with this and other sessions in the program. So the question up for debate today is, can our behavior change response to the COVID crisis help us in changing behaviors to address the climate crisis? With us is Amy Bucher, author and behavior scientist, so welcome. Danielle Siembieda, an artist and also managing director of Leonardo, which is a peer-reviewed art and science journal. And Peter Weeme, who is a sustainability expert and newly appointed as the VP of Social Purpose and Stakeholder Engagement at BC Lottery Corporation. So to all of you, thank you for joining us. I, for one, never really thought that we would see this kind of overnight global behavior shift that we're seeing with COVID. And I think this is very encouraging for the climate crisis, as traumatic as it is. But this group is, I think, in agreement that for human accelerated climate change, our global behaviors are a major obstacle. So I wanted to start with Amy and say, what's your point of view on behavior and climate before we get to COVID?
Yeah, I think behavior change is really difficult for people in terms of climate because the timeframes associated with it are quite long. And we're really asking people to make sacrifices or trade-offs in the present day for a far-off future. What we see happening with COVID that's really interesting is an acceleration of those same sorts of timelines where our individual behavior as a group, in the aggregate, is really affecting public health outcomes at scale. And we're seeing it happen in a matter of weeks rather than years or decades. And some of the behaviors that we're having to adjust in order to adapt to COVID are the same behaviors or parallel behaviors to ones that we need to adopt for climate change. I approach my work through a motivational perspective, and a model that I use quite a bit is called the self-determination theory of motivation. Part of what that theory says is that we engage in experiences that meet our three basic psychological needs, which are autonomy or meaningful choice, competence or seeing that we're having an effect in the world, we're learning and growing and achieving, and then relatedness, feeling connected to others. And that idea of competence in particular is one that is really difficult in these sorts of situations because of that long time frame I mentioned. And so I think one of the positive things that's coming out of COVID is that we are actually seeing evidence that this change in our behavior that we're doing for public health reasons is having really positive effects on the climate side. And so I think that's going to start to build a credible evidence base that we can leverage in the after to continue this sort of positive behavior change.
So Danielle, what is your artist's perspective on this?
So I approach behavior change in a couple of different ways. When I look at what's happening with COVID and also with the climate crisis, I kind of look at this before and after. Prior to actually, for me, the before is around 5 years ago, and where I'm thinking about how I approach a behavior change using this BJ Fogg model, who's also a social behaviorist, psychiatrist out of Stanford, who looks at ability, trigger, and motivation in order for somebody to actually take action and actually look at their own personal behavior. But what has been happening over the last 4 years, and then also that's kind of has set the tone and the situation for what's going on with people's reaction responses to COVID is who to trust and what information is out there. And I think that artists, my approach, and not just my approach, but I think other artists are looking at this as well, is like that now is the time to start to really take a lot of our ability to ask questions, to sit at the table with others, and to work in collaboration with the medical community, the environmental science community, and then also policymakers to actually take agency to create some of those behavioral change structures. Where I see this happening is in being able to translate all of these complex systems and this information. When you're communicating something around the science and the facts around COVID to a general public, it's really difficult to disseminate that information. And what we've been seeing is just this big ball that with spikes around it, and that's sort of our icon for COVID. And I don't think that's helping in any of us anyway. It's not really, we can't relate this ball to our personal and emotional selves, and thus we're not necessarily acting on those changes. It's only those who are kind of enveloping that science that are really spearheading in their own communities and telling people around them, this is what's going on, please understand, and working on that translation. This is where I feel myself as an artist and other artists should be coming into this dialogue, is actually like, let's not use the same problem that we had in communicating climate science. It's like, here's this marble, here's this ball, and this is what you should understand as the icon, and it's these icons are what actually make what the problem is, and that's actually hasn't shifted a mass public behavioral change. So I think reshifting the way that we think about things in this visual, and not just letting somebody else lead in that, but actually having artists come to the forefront to really kind of think about those questions, and the visual communications in which that can be conveyed is really critical in order to have that motivation part of changing behavior in the COVID and its parallel with the climate crisis.
Thank you. Peter, from the sustainability perspective, what are you seeing in terms of behavior and climate, and I guess perhaps COVID?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about behavior changes, there's a bunch of different dimensions that we're talking about, right? Particularly when it pertains to climate action. One of them is is that conserving behavior, where we want people to, for example, reduce their carbon footprint, and in that case, it's more about frugality and thrift that we're speaking to. Another kind of behavior change is helping people to avoid harm, and this might be reducing the impact of their behaviors or the environmental impacts associated with having a carbon-rich life. And in that case, we can maybe appeal to people in terms of responsibility or self-control and giving them a sense of agency in the situation. Some of the behavior change might be around transformation and getting people to adopt new products that, for example, electric vehicles, so that they're viewing themselves as sort of part of this sort of innovative new world that we're living in, and in that particular case, obviously, we're appealing to people's sense of agency there as well. Another form of behavior change is influencing others, is sort of waking people up and saying, you have a role to play here, and some of this is information, some of this is education, some of this is incentive, some of this is recognition. Governments can play a role, businesses can play a role, individuals like you and me can play a role with our friends and our spheres of influence. And then, the fifth way I think that we can look at changing behaviors is around the taking initiative, getting people to sort of lobby or become activists. So when we talk about behavior change, one of the main points that I want to make is that there's different dimensions to that. Some of it's changing individuals' behavior and the choices that they make. Some of them is also giving that person the sense, or organizations the sense, that they can influence and help change others. And we're seeing that with the current COVID situation, and I think those realities are completely transferable, or those sort of behavior change domains are completely relevant in a climate conversation.
I am so happy to hear you say that, because as somebody who's watched sustainability for many years, I always thought this would be on the never, never plan, that we would never move the globe in behavior change or shift it in a way that is going to be more helpful at scale around the planet. And I think COVID shows us that we can do it, and we can do it really fast. The rapid application of some of these restrictions, and behavior compliance is something I don't think we have seen in climate. And is there something about the COVID situation that we should be really focusing on now in climate? I don't know, Amy, do you want to start on that? Just the fast response of COVID?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think part of what's going on with that is that the effects of COVID are relatively fast. So, transmission it's viral. Tongue in cheek to say that, because it is a virus, but it transmits quite rapidly, quite easily between people, and you fall ill in a matter of weeks, and the fatality rate is relatively high for a viral infection. And so we're seeing these really the very most meaningful sorts of outputs in a fairly rapid fashion. So I think there's a realization, first of all, that our behavior really matters. And, I think another thing to consider too is that human beings behave within structures that are imposed from without. So we have governments, we have, regulatory bodies that create the circumstances in which we behave. And so part of what we're seeing with COVID is that, we are being asked by our local and our federal governments to stay at home. Non-essential businesses are being closed down. Our options of ways to behave are being dramatically restricted. And so we're responding to that. And the beautiful thing is that we're a very resilient species. We figure out ways to adapt our behaviors to these new constraints. An example I've used in the past talking about sustainability pre-COVID is smoking cessation, because it's a similar sort of behavioral dynamic where we saw societal level, a lot of individuals changing their behavior, but very much in response to policy and societal level shifts. So as cigarette taxes increased, as there were more restrictions on where people can smoke in public, you saw a dramatic fall in the smoking rate. And today in the United States, if you look at statistics around smoking, there's a very clear correlation between smoking rate and the local policies and regulations that are in place. So I think part of what we're seeing again with COVID is that it's some of these structures that provide the guardrails of society that are also going to guide individual behavior. And that's a lesson that I think we should not forget when it comes time to really turn our focus more explicitly to climate change once this crisis has passed.
So, Peter, is it just policy, or is it something else that's propelling the COVID crisis much better or faster than climate? Because I think that they're probably concurrent crises.
Well, I think there's a number of points. One of them is it's visual, right? Like we can see, people can immediately tell whether or not you're complying with these social distancing norms and so on, right? And so there's an immediate normative kind of behavior that, like everybody is suspect of everybody else, right? And we all have like these invisible bubbles around us as we move through parks or supermarkets or whatever. So I think that that's a bit different than in the case of climate, where our carbon emissions are something that we don't really see. But certainly that visual aspect, I think, to COVID has been really critical. That immediacy that I think that Amy spoke to, like it's a question of life and death right now. It's urgent. There's lots of consensus with health experts and organizations on how to respond. There are cases of politicians, whether it's Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Trudeau in Canada, Merkel in Germany, who have really built some political capital with this. They've shown leadership. I'm afraid to say that has not happened in the United States, but it has happened in a number of other countries. And I think we can still learn from these things, right? So part of the challenge around climate change is how do we create that sense of immediacy and that sense of urgency? How do we bring that forward to people today so that they feel the same desire to act as they have around COVID? And how do we make it more visual? Well, maybe through recognition and rewards in other ways, so that people sort of almost have like badges of various kinds. And I don't mean like literal badges, but sort of recognition, forms of recognition that show who's, and that's actually what popularized the Toyota Prius, was that people drove that car because that said, I'm an environmentalist. Right, and that immediately, and I care about the environment. And there's more ways that we can do that, I think. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me in terms of what we can learn from COVID and how that might translate into some of the ways that we take action around climate.
Danielle, when you're working in the art and science space with Leonardo, do you see people in your sphere, in your practice, looking at the urgency of COVID and trying to translate that to climate, or is there some sort of bridge here that art is going to be able to amplify?
Oh, it's absolutely translating to climate in so many different ways. We're holding a lot of spaces, a lot of virtual community spaces. We've been doing that pretty much since the beginning of this situation that we're in. And what we've noticed is that people first were really excited to connect with each other, because now that everybody's grounded in at least in the art science community, people are traveling nonstop. There's prior to I guess mid-March, I personally was traveling. I was in London for a conference, and then I was in Paris for another conference. And then as soon as I landed back in the plane from Paris, they said, "Okay, you're the last flight. No one gets to leave again." And so I was lucky just to get in back in the country. And I was also there with many people from Australia, from the US, from the EU. But what is happening is people from all the world have now been connecting with each other, because of course no one is leaving, and artists are becoming very not just resilient, but they're becoming incredibly creative, but they're wanting to dive really deep. So what has been happening is there's been these threads of new ideas that have been evolving and deploying extremely fast. So for example, there's a lot of people who are addressing the problems with the food markets, and actually with the animal science and like the animal supply chain, the food chain of animals, but also with the idea of animal testing. That has really actually been a major spur that a lot of artists are addressing in that area. I saw immediately not just the the mass that people are doing on the DIY level, but we had artists come in and, especially ones that were working in biolabs, start to hack medical equipment and post how to do that type of thing on your own and actually create them in very interesting and creative ways. So that's something that people are addressing. People are addressing the oceans there, especially since now we're seeing a lot of clarity and things clearing up in oceanography and ocean memory. Those sorts of projects are really blooming. But there's also a lot of focus on what's happening domestically in the home. That's something that I feel like this conversation also needs to address and acknowledge, that when we talk about things like the Prius and we talk about the Amazon deliveries and we talk about being able to go to your local markets, that's completely privileged, and that's really something that I don't think many people around the world have that ability to really share in that same experience, because what people in the Western worlds are have been able to access from all that rapid delivery systems and all these access to technology, we have a climate debt to pay, because there's people in Uganda and in Africa and all around the world who don't have any of those systems, who are also suffering the same things that we are, but they don't have the same sort of leadership. They don't have the same medical access, and they don't have the same sort of supply chain resources that we have here. So I do want to recognize that. I think artists are also addressing that. I think especially at the level with UNESCO and their call for creative collaboration.
So we're taping this session at the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. While COVID is fast moving and changing daily, governments are today looking at reopening the economy. So I wanted to say, one, that I'm hoping everybody at home is staying safe and healthy. But two, are there specific COVID behaviors that we're seeing that we would want to continue for climate, or are there behaviors that are switched off that should be left switched off? Who wants to start?
I'll jump in on a couple of them. I think some of the things that have sort of really struck me during this period is the vast and sudden reduction in transport and travel and working from home. And I think that that's something that companies in particular can leverage or work with. There's a lot of environmental savings, social benefits, and economic benefits that actually come from allowing employees to work from home. So that's something that I think I'm seeing, certainly in the company that I work for. We were doing a pilot project with 10 people working from home in a company of 1,000 people, and then we went to 950 people working from home. And so, this is going to become, I think, a new thing. And now that, not everybody wants to work from home every day and be, wedded to Zoom or Skype, but it is nice to be able to do that a couple of days a week, let's say. So I think we're going to see that. The focus on local businesses and the vulnerability of our global supply chain, the whole toilet paper kind of issue is a great example of that. I think we're seeing that people are starting to value that local economy and local retailers, and you see people calling out, like, please support your local restaurant and that kind of thing. Again, there's climate benefits to that, so hopefully we're going to continue to see that persist. Then there's also just the degree of collaboration and support that people are providing each other. There's an app called Nextdoor.com that I'm on in my neighborhood, and I think is available for people in a number of different places. And I'm really impressed by how people are looking out for each other. They want to help each other. And so hopefully we can draw on that social capital, because we're going to need that if, the climate solutions are not individual only. There's a collectivist component to that. And maybe, just maybe, we will have sort of broken a little bit that whole endorphin high that comes from consumption that human beings seem hardwired for. People have done without a lot. They're also seeing, although some people are having financial hardship as a result of not, maybe making what they did before. For the same token, people are seeing that, hey, if I don't spend so much money, A, my life is simpler, B, I have more savings. So this may, I think, impact people, or at least make them more conscious about some of their consumption. At least I'm hopeful for that. I was hopeful for that after the 2008 meltdown too, but maybe we just need a couple of runs at it to make it really stick.
Amy, I'm wondering what the social science tells us in this regard.
Yeah, well, I was thinking while Peter was talking, and it goes back to an earlier point he made about the status that comes with certain decisions and the visibility of certain decisions. And I think that one thing that we will probably see is some of these more, earth-friendly behaviors persisting if they can be amplified and given sort of a social status. So there's been jokes about it, but people making their own bread it's kind of a good pandemic hobby, because if you're in the house all day, it requires a little bit of attention, a little bit of care. But we're seeing a really positive response from other people when you put your fresh baked loaves on Instagram, or saying in an email, I've been home baking all day. And I think that those sorts of positive social reactions will help to reinforce some of these new behaviors. I've also been really pleased to see how some of the shift to remote has helped with disability access. So that's an issue that, I care about. And for a long time, I've seen disabled people who have talked about, let's moving things virtual, making accommodations using technology so that they may be able to do a type of work that is otherwise more difficult. And I think there's been a lot of resistance to that historically for a number of reasons. It's just not the way things are done. And I think there's also been an implicit understanding that to do remote work well takes some thoughtfulness. And so to extend those accommodations means having to go through that thoughtful process of figuring out how to do the work. And it just didn't seem like a priority, but now we're forced into it. And so I am hopeful that we will remain more flexible about the way work gets done so that we can extend that to more people, to people who may traditionally have been excluded from certain types of work for no really good reason, not because they're not interested or able to do it, but because we just weren't able to shift the way it was done to accommodate them. And I think that it actually will also extend just not even work, but things like the arts. I've been really pleased in the last few weeks to be able to watch performances online, or I've attended a few virtual book discussions with authors where if they had held them in the traditional way, they would have been elsewhere in the country or the world. I would never have been able to be there firsthand. But suddenly I'm able to participate in some of these artistic experiences, and that's been a really beautiful thing. So I'm hopeful that will persist as well.
For friends of Broto, you would know that we've had an in-person conference up until this year, and this is our first experience and experiment with online virtual conferences. And I think largely it's successful, and we do get to talk to people who wouldn't have been able to come to us or weren't available previously. So I do think that there's a shift to virtual world that we will stick to. At least I hope so. Danielle, you alluded to this, the idea of this issue being steeped in privilege, and I wanted just to have us have a quick conversation, if we can, about what COVID is showing us in terms of disproportionate equality issues around whole communities not being able to comply because they don't have the socioeconomic station that four white people talking about this have. And this does resonate with the climate justice and economic social justice that comes around the climate argument. So I'm just wondering if you see fairness in this issue, and if you see how we might be able to extend that to the climate discussion.
I think that it depends on the government situation and where they're at. I would say another point of privilege that I'm in the state of California, where it's a very resourced state, and in an area where that our local politicians are held to quite accountable for what they do and what they don't do. So, for example, for students who don't have access to laptops and technology, the schools gave them that. And for food, they're still providing the food. So everyone is still being is being fed and has a laptop. However, you don't know how safe it is in their homes or if they have a home. For homeless shelters, the governor has worked to put together, I think, 150,000 rooms across the state to be able to provide emergency housing for vulnerable homeless communities. We're also a state, though, that just went through several natural disasters, and there's something that we also need to understand when it comes to points of privilege and response and access. Is that what's happening right here with this quick turnaround for an entire world to react to something has been spotlighted in a sense with natural disasters, and those natural disasters are a result of the climate crisis. They are direct result from that, and you have seen those communities themselves go completely wiped out, economies wiped out, people are homeless. Like in Northern California, there is a mile-long road of tents because people in Lake County, the entire cities were completely annihilated and gone, which created this mass problem. So the response to, okay, we're here in our homes that are still upright, that are still structured, we're not seeing what's happening in Lake County and responding to what's happening in Lake County, although we are responding to what's happening on a local level. I think that on the Peter was right. Nextdoor has been really good about activating how you can help on that local level. But I think about places like in India and in China, where you have people who are 10 to a room. There's mold that those families can't separate. They can't be distant from each other at all. Who is addressing that? And I think this idea that some of the big companies like Google and the big ones that have a lot of control are offering free services. There's only so much they can do at the last minute. So one of the things that I'm hoping we learn from this is that we are much better equipped, much better organized to deploy things for emergency response. I think this is not going to be the only time we're going to have to deal with this. So I think just wake up. This is not just about COVID, but this is going to happen with other disasters, other crises, other emergencies that we're going to have to deal with as a globe, right? So we need to then build upon these systems and structure them properly so that we can actually really address everyone who isn't getting attention on them as well. So it's as brief as I could be on that.
Thank you very much. Peter, I wanted to just touch in with you in that, climate justice is obviously one of those big issues in the climate crisis. And I think COVID is, people who are frontline workers, people who are first responders, people who are helpers are still taking public transit. They're not wearing masks. They're not doing some of these things because they can't afford them. This just to me screams what's going to happen with the climate crisis. And I'm just thinking that there has to be a fairness lesson here. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, I think Danielle has spoken to that, sort of the disproportionate impact of this is felt with people who are lower income or marginalized in some way, shape, or form. And if you look at the sort of the relaxation of social distancing and so on, who are the people that are last to be affected by that social distancing relaxation? It's the people at the top of the pyramid. It's the office workers. Who are the people that are going to be released first? It's the restaurant workers. It's the frontline people, right? It's the people who are part of the gig economy. There's a huge issue right now. I was reading about a food delivery guy who said, here I am risking my life to bring rich people food. Right. And that is, the reality. And I think if we can take one lesson away from this, it's hopefully that you can't find a solution to addressing COVID if you don't address these social inequalities, because otherwise we'll have large pockets of people who are potential vectors for the virus. And it's the same thing with climate. What this demands is some policy intervention, government intervention for the most part. what's interesting is we're seeing things like basic income, which for years has been something that's been talked about, and there's been some pilot projects and other things. Well, in effect, Canada just brought in, for example, basic income, because anybody who lost their job, you got $2,000 a month. And Spain has said, we are now going to make basic income actually part of our policy going forward. So we need things like that. We need specific investments in neighborhoods and in communities that are that will support the underserved, the marginalized. We have to map what those climate vulnerable areas are. Again, you look at New Orleans and what happened with the hurricane there. It was people who were poor, who were disproportionately affected by the levees breaking and so on. So there is no way that we can that we can act on the climate emergency without addressing social inequalities. And I think the COVID situation has further drawn attention. I think we all knew that, and we've seen that with this sort of trickle down kind of economics approach that started with Reagan. Just does not work. The rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer, and COVID has just shone a spotlight on how profound that gulf has become. And if we don't address that, we're not going to be able to address the climate emergency effectively either.
So if it's not clear already, I'm someone who believes that the COVID crisis is a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis. I'm wondering if how the COVID crisis has shown us how we might navigate the climate crisis specifically. So, Amy, do you want to give it a shot?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking as Peter was just talking, and I think it's relevant here, is that, when you think about motivation, the source of motivation really matters. And the type of motivation that keeps us going when things get tough, when we are making decisions and doing things that, maybe cause a little bit of friction for us or feel unpleasant in the moment. What usually keeps people going is when they are motivated by a goal that's really meaningful to them or a personal value. And as much as we would like to think that everybody has values of caring for others and equality, the fact is that most people have some or a lot of self-interest in the way that they make decisions. And I think that this current crisis is really showing us the self-interested reasons why we need to care about others. So we think about our service workers. If I think about who I'm grateful for on a day-to-day basis right now, it's the person who brings my mail. It's the person who I know I can order a pizza from if I don't have, if I'm too busy with my very lucky to have office job working from home to prepare dinner. I'm hopeful that people will recognize that these are the people who are the fabric of society, who keep things running, who are important for all of us, and therefore it's in everybody's own self-interest to advocate for policies that support them. And those same policies will contribute to improving some of the climate issues. The thing that we are seeing with COVID as well as people are recognizing the really huge role that their local officials play in the way that their community is able to respond. And we're seeing a lot of difference around the country in terms of, who is the governor of your state, who is the mayor of your town, and so forth. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful for, because those are the same people who are making some of the decisions and the policies related to climate, is that people will begin to take their local elections more seriously. I feel very fortunate to live in Boston. We've had really strong local leadership through the COVID crisis. And it's also an area of the country where we've recognized for a while now that we need to get serious about climate change as well. We're on the water, so we're worried about rising sea levels and what that will do to the community over time. And so there's been a lot of really great, and to one of Danielle's points, very visual modeling that the city has commissioned and released to residents so that we really understand what some of these decisions we're making around our climate behaviors might have, not even that far down the road, 10, 20 years, before we finish paying off our mortgages. So I think that whole local connection could end up being a really powerful tool that we can then repurpose to continue the fight against climate.
Peter.
Yeah, so I think a few things that come to mind for me that that show us how that we can draw from the COVID crisis for the climate crisis is transparency and timeliness, and we've seen good politicians and good public health officials out there daily on an ongoing basis sharing what they know and doing that with as much in the case of British Columbia where I live, we publish the percentage of ICU beds that are being, for example, used, and that gives people a really great sense of how compelling or how significant the COVID crisis is. I think there's a larger role, and linked to that is a larger role for health professionals. The climate crisis is largely a health crisis as well in many respects. We're going to see new diseases and new vectors and so on. So I think we can draw more on those public health professionals because they seem to have credibility and the public listens to them, as it were, or views them as being credible. I think also we've had a bit of a big bang and some massive big bang of sorts in the sense of, suddenly we were hit by COVID and there's been massive government investments made in a very short time frame. For the longest time, we were told we don't have the money to address the climate crisis. Well, in this particular case, we're seeing that we can actually mobilize resources when human lives are threatened. So let's actually learn from that, folks, and let's do it as a preventative investment, not in the case of COVID, where we're just responding to a crisis as it's happening. I think COVID has also, underscored how vulnerable our global supply chains are and how globalized our economy is. And so they're delicate and they're vulnerable, and they're only going to be more under threat with catastrophic weather events, for example. And I think the last thing, which sort of links back to something that Danielle said earlier, is the role of visuals. And we've seen, for example, in this COVID case, that the curve and flattening the curve, everybody has a mental model of what that looks like. People get it. And the point behind that is that visuals can play a really important role in helping people understand what the problem is and what their intervention can do to that problem. So hopefully policymakers, activists, and others are going to draw from those lessons as we look to now shift our attention, hopefully in the very near future, to the climate crisis. The one thing I am concerned about is that there will be fatigue from dealing with COVID and the massive investments, financial investments and indebtedness. Like the American economy, I think, is going to have a $2 trillion deficit this year. And that governments are going to go, we have no money now. We have no money to deal with the climate crisis. And that would be a tragedy.
As a final comment, where can art and science lead us in this new world going to be post-COVID towards a better shot at sustainability? Something brief.
Okay. Now is the time for us to be able to act. The time is ripe where we have all of us here that are in this room, plus the fact that we're now connected globally with other scientists and researchers. We can actually build the future that we've been talking about for so long. So let's not waste this time and think about it again. Let's actually start to take some action. Let's lead in this. Let's figure out how we can become more, in the words of Diana Aiton-Shanker, how could we become more human and humane? How can we humanize technology? How can we use this to solve the climate crisis? We can do it. Let's just come together right now and move forward, because we've already started to begin to shape a better future for ourselves and the rest of our planet. So I hope that we continue to do that, especially since this Earth Week.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up. I want to say thank you to our guests for zooming in to this conference and providing us with some great insights around COVID and climate. To our friends at home, if you see value in panel or other panels, please consider a donation, because we are offering this for free, but we are a nonprofit organization, so consider a generous donation. Thank you to our group. Are we all here?
I think so.
Yes.
Excellent.
Reporting in from Vancouver.
Hey, excellent. So it has been 2 weeks since we recorded that piece, and I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts on this subject since then.
Lots of thoughts. I'm not sure that all of them are very positive. I think certainly something that's come to the forefront for me is just the financial costs of responding to this, and the great fear that I have that now basically governments are going to say, we have no money. to address the climate crisis. It looks like it's going to be several years before we get out of this. In the United States, I think it was $2 trillion they're calling for a deficit this year. Canada, $250 billion, which is 5 times higher than any deficit we've ever had. So my big concern as this continues to unfold and as we see job losses and so on is just policymakers are going to say, the cupboard is bare. Sorry, folks, we lost our chance.
Yeah, I've had, and this came up in the chat quite a bit, but I've had my attention drawn more explicitly to some of the equity issues at play here. And so I mentioned in the chat, like one thing that I've become aware of in the last few weeks, just by talking to people who are really involved in the public education system, is that in some areas, so public education charters are written that they have to offer the same educational services equitably to all of the students they serve. And so in some areas where you have some students who don't have technology access, the way that the system is dealing with that is by offering everybody very minimal instruction. Because if they offered something online and a big portion of the students weren't able to access that, then they wouldn't be equitable. And so rather than solving the equity problem, they sort of just say, well, we're giving everybody terrible education. And I think that that is a really easy fallback approach for institutions and people to take when a problem is really hard. And this is a really hard problem. It requires, really rethinking the way that we live our lives. And so I guess one of the things that has changed a little bit for me since we've recorded this is that I am now in a little bit more of a place of trepidation that we've been handed this opportunity to do that rethinking, to really reshape things and move away from what was the status quo. And I'm worried that because there's some effort and investment involved, we're not going to do it. So I think we really need to, be aggressive, be out there, doing political advocacy, because I do think that we have to involve politicians. I think there has to be that political lever pulled, and really mobilizing around this if we want to take advantage of this moment.
One of the questions that has come up in the chat box is that how do we change these power structures that have created these inequities? I'm wondering if anybody has a silver bullet for this.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this because people have been using this word so much, redo, rethink, regeneration, and I'm right now I'm really bothered by the word re. Why are we redoing something? Where is this that meaning that what we had in the pre was sufficient, or that was okay, or that was accepted? So the pre was like got us to a certain point, and now we're redoing it, not as if we're creating something new. We're just redoing it. And I've been thinking about this economic and economic, cultural, and political structures that need to be happening to make things happen. And I think that we need new, not something that is rethought, something that is forward thinking. Because what's happening is that we're just basing everything on what we've done in the past rather than sort of designing something completely new for the future. I think there's got to be a little bit of both, though, happening at the same time, because something has to give us some sort of groundway to move forward. Those who with a lot of power have already pulled out their deep, dark, secret policies from, that they've hidden up in chests and drawers and said, okay, great, let's take it to the American Legislative and Executive Council and start pushing this through all the states. And that's what's happening. You're seeing that, especially with the deregulation of everything and what people like Betsy DeVos have done to education and women. So, we want to make sure that when we're considering these things, we kind of take it on full force, because I think there's this ability for us to really come in there on the policy level. That means having us vote, run for office, stand up for what we believe in. But I think we really actually need to think about these complex systems and these paradigm shifts within those complex systems. And we have the brain power to do that, because we're actually, between the artists and scientists and the social scientists and the biologists and the doctors, everybody loves complexity. We're a group that's like, we would say, oh, we have a really complex problem. Then we're the first people to go, wait, I want to do the complex problem, right? We're not afraid of that whatsoever. So we're the right group of people to tackle it. I think what we need to do though is we need somebody to manage it, or a group to manage it. Leonardo, I know, is working really hard on this in this area, but it's not going to be a one bullet answer. We have to take this from all different sides. Think about the new, and while like pushing back on the old, to make that happen, to make that space happen.
I think one other thing is we have to get rid of the male, pale, and stale paradigm that's running the world. Quite frankly, you look at the people who have shown the most leadership during this COVID crisis. It's the female leaders. It's the female people who are in the healthcare sector and so on. It's quite frankly, we've had enough of the patriarchy, and we have to change that system, because women make much better and more informed decisions for the most part than men, and having too many men running things has proven to be fatal, quite frankly. So I think one of the main answers is looking for more representation in our leadership. It's a critical issue, and you're seeing companies or jurisdictions do that with directors on boards of directors, and or in terms of their parliaments and things like that. We need more of that, quite frankly, because otherwise we're just going to continue in the same pattern of decision making.
One of the backdrops for the Broto project is working to imagine a world made sustainable. What do we do? How do we envision a life that when we can relax, we can say that we fixed the climate crisis, and then work backward to try and figure out what we need to do? To me, COVID is a ripe opportunity to reinvent and to think about some of these very systemic issues in new ways that can maybe add new power to their solutions. What should we keep switched off? What should we not go back to? What are the behaviors that we ought not to do?
There's so many.
Where to start?
I think for one, let's just put it this way. I think for one, it's simplicity. I think there's a kind of simplicity in the COVID crisis that we might want to foster in a post-COVID world. There's a sense of a different kind of consumerism that is something that we might want to foster in a post-COVID world. So there are aspects of how we're living in confinement that I think helps us think about climate differently, or our response to climate. So I guess that's where my question was going, is that, how can we parlay what we're doing now into some sort of strategy that helps the climate?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that is really powerful right now is that we are seeing evidence of the results of our behaviors in a way that we don't normally, because there's so many factors have just been taken out of the equation. So we're able to isolate some of our other factors. And so, I'm noticing a lot around my own food consumption and how I prepare my meals and do my grocery shopping, because previously I would just, stop into the grocery store 4 or 5 times a week when I walked by on my commute and get what I needed for that night's dinner. But it meant that there was also a lot of waste, and I wasn't being as planful as I am now. And, I'm taking a lot of pleasure in that too. So I think that I'll bring those habits forward, even if my shopping, if I go back to shopping more frequently. Something like ordering packages out of necessity. I know I've been doing a lot more online shopping because I can't go to the store to get things I might otherwise have picked up, but it's really making it apparent to me some of the costs to the environment in terms of the packaging, and, seeing that I'm home all day too. So I see how many delivery trucks come and idle, and, they're giving off exhaust. And so I'm becoming more aware, and I can already feel myself. I haven't sat down and done like a big replanning of the way that I do my online orders, but I'm already asking myself, like, should I group those things together? Could I maybe buy those things from the same retailer so I have fewer packages, and making those sorts of decisions, because there's no real cost to me, but I can see the cost on the other end.
I'm mindful of time. We have a hard 60-minute close. So I wanted to, first of all, say thank you to everyone for their amazing participation and support of this project, and this particular idea that came about in the last month or so as we had to remake the conference into an online version because of the coronavirus. I'm wondering if we can leave our audience with one last idea about how COVID is teaching us how to be better climate stewards. Any?
Well, I think COVID has certainly shown how resilient the world can be, and how behavior change can have pretty immediate, visible changes, positive changes, on the world around us. And so I hope that in some way people have had an opportunity to reconnect with some of those values, to see, and to appreciate, to see a blue sky for the first time in a long time, and so on. And that some of those memories and some of those impressions will actually motivate people, or continue to give people some of the fuel that they need to take action on climate change, and to pressure for action on climate change.
I think what we're seeing right now too is how tightly we're woven into a social fabric, and how if we want to make real change and we want to sustain that change, our individual actions are important, but that can't be everything. And this is the positive side of what I was saying before about what's changed for me in the last few weeks since we recorded the panel. We need to be advocates. We need to be out there involved in our local and our national politics. We need to be talking to our communities, our families, our friends, and enlisting them in this work, because it won't happen if we do it alone. And so I think that, just really understanding that we're more than just individuals. We are a piece of the social fabric, and then pulling on those threads to make change happen.
And I'll just close off with focusing on the community, focusing on your local village, your block. This has actually been the most important, and not only necessary, but rewarding unit in the urban development, especially if you're living in an urban or rural area. Understanding how you actually can connect with your neighbors, and to share information, to educate each other, to support and empathize with the needs. Maybe somebody is sick. Maybe you have garden seedlings to share. Maybe this is about exchanging sourdough bread. Whatever tools those are that are using you that you're reaching out to somebody and they're reaching out to you, so that you can actually build that trust and strength, is going to actually help us in the long run when it comes to the climate, and when it comes to being able to recover from other pandemics that we will have in the future. When all else fails, if we don't have emergency responders, like, whether it be fire or police or whoever is there, it is your next door neighbors. It is the people on your block and the blocks next to them that you're going to need to depend on. And so being able to support the environment around you, and being able to support them and they support you, is what's really central. Because if all the government structures in the world failed, when it comes down to it, it's who lives around you that's going to be who's going to lift you up. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us to use and learn. I think social practice artists get that quite a bit, and I encourage everybody to think about that. One model I'm going to just stick in there is look at the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture Green New Deal plan, how they focus on actually teaching artists how to be agents of change in that process. I think it's a really good model that we can replicate, and actually educate each other through understanding this pandemic and other policy related and environmental related actions that we can actually approach. So thank you to everybody who's been in the chat, and and Amy and Peter and Ian and Matt and everyone who's organized Broto for this fantastic panel. This has been really educational.
Yeah, but please tell your friends, because they can watch these recordings even if they couldn't be here today. And hopefully we can inspire more action on climate.
Yep, and there are additional panels tomorrow as well. So if you're available, or someone who'd be interested, please attend those.
Okay, well, thanks everyone.